Okay, you can start.
While he's doing that, I'd like to thank Maurice for something that I don't know how many of you are aware of. And that is that a year ago, July 4th weekend, I started to cough. I couldn't stop. I coughed until October the 12th, where I was basically pronounced dead. So obviously, it took 8 months to get over that. So put a year together, and I did nothing for Convention of States. Maurice took over. I said, hey, I'll give up my half directorship. You be the director. He said, no, you'll recover. So I eventually did, and I'm partially active now. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank Maurice for doing what he did, which is selflessly take over this organization and build it a lot better than it would have been built if I'd still been engaged. So thank you, Maurice. You've been a great friend.
I'll never let you off the hook. You don't get off the hook that easy.
I'm not trying to get off any hook.
Cancer is no excuse.
It was also endocarditis, but why mention the bigger things? First of all, I'm very, very honored to be able to do this now. If the room were full of 1,000 people, or if there were 10, as long as it's the people of your quality, I am totally honored. Really, thank you very much. I want to tell you a story about a very remarkable person. But before I get to that, I want to remind you about the three tenets of Convention of States. There's term limits, there's states' rights, or rejecting government overreach, and there's the federal deficit and the overspending that's obligating our great-great-grandchildren, etc. So I want to focus on the last one because I have a personal experience, a lifelong experience with overspending and the inability to overspend. So I want to tell you about my mother. My mother would have been 113 2 days ago. Great lady, little lady, full of guts lady. A lady who always believed that the glass was half full or more. I used to accuse her of saying, you know, you could be standing in a sewage pit and you'd say, what a nice color, brown. She just had this spirit. And let me tell you some exemplifications of that spirit. She was born into a family that owned a private, very, very exclusive school for boys. My grandfather ran it. There were like 4 teachers that traveled with the seasons. They had the Mellons, the Carnegies, the Woolworths, the Vanderbilts, the Vandenbergs. Roosevelt, got a great picture of my grandfather, Teddy Roosevelt, standing in a boat down in Florida. At any rate, she was born into, let's say, a privileged environment. So she was the youngest of 4 sisters in a school for boys, attractive young girl. She was very popular. So she went through this teenage, growing up, went away to university. The point I'm going to make is that she never learned to work. She never acquired a skill because she didn't have to. This isn't working well, is it?
It's okay.
Because I don't need it, but anyway.
You need it.
Okay. So, at any rate, in 1928 in Chicago, she was a student at Northwestern. She met my dad, who was a visiting engineer from England, and in 1930 they got married and moved to England. Went through World War II. My brother was born, then I was born, and my dad was running a factory with probably 90% female out of his 6,000 work staff, 6,000 people. He naturally drifted. My mother found out about it, and she dumped him. Now, being an American, as soon as the war was over, she wanted to come back to the United States. It took 2 years for us to get permission to come. There was a monthly trip from where we lived, which was pretty nice, to Liverpool, which was bombed out, to renew our application and come back, for her to come back to the United States and bring her sons with her. So, at any rate, eventually we were allowed to do that. And in 1947, we emigrated to the United States. We left Southampton, England, one of the last days of February, and we arrived in New York early in March. The significance of that is that during that boat trip, the pound was devalued by 1/3. So her child support of $420 a month became $280 a month. So we arrived, moved to Detroit, moved in with her sister and her family, and we lived there for a short time until she realized that we needed to get out because we weren't helping their family situation. She had an uncle in Whittier, California, who had written to her and told her that things are great in California. All kinds of jobs, all kinds of opportunities. So she advertised in the Detroit News and found a rideshare deal to California. And now the little family party now included my grandmother, who was the acting president of a chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The importance of that will be evident in a moment. So there was a cottage industry in those days where they needed cars in California. All the troops that had gone to the Pacific had gone through California and understood immediately what a paradise it was in those days. So there weren't enough cars there. So a guy who wanted to go into this cottage industry could buy a, let's say a 1938 Chrysler in Cleveland, drive it to Los Angeles, sell it for 3 or 4 times what he paid for it in Cleveland, and then take the Greyhound bus back and do it again. And there was a lot of men doing that. So my mother made a deal with a guy over the phone to come pick us up on a certain day with our luggage, and we were going to go to California together. Well, that's how much faith in people she had, and how much spirit she had, how much self-confidence she had. Because he was a total stranger. She didn't know that he had just arrived from Ireland, and typical of the, ideas about Irish men, he was drunk all the time. So, fortunately, she figured out in about the first half hour that my grandmother needed to be sitting in the co-pilot seat. And my grandmother harangued this poor guy for 2,500 miles about the evils of gin and whiskey, right? Well, the car broke down in Marshalltown, Iowa, caught fire in North Platte, Nebraska, and couldn't make up the hill out of Las Vegas. So our little trip of 4 days became 7 days. And of course, when we left Detroit, she probably had $80. My grandmother might have had $40. And we somehow made it work to get to California. Well, the guy dumped us on her uncle's porch and left, fortunately, not having to hear from my grandmother again. And so we lived with my uncle for about a month. Again, no money. We had no money. So then she saw an ad in the paper about share a house. So we went out and looked at this house. It was out on a 14-acre orange grove. And we wound up taking the bottom part of the house. The old man who owned it lived upstairs. My grandmother kept house, cooked. My mother went to work cleaning houses and taking care of babies for other people. And my brother and I learned to work. That's how we started in the United States, how we started in California. So we moved forward. Things got a little bit better each time, but not really. Not to the point where we were able to buy a car, a television, anything like that. Didn't matter. We made ends meet. I remember a couple of times where I'd be studying in my room, and I would hear my mother crying. That was very uncharacteristic. I'd go knock on her door and say, "Mother, what's the matter?" And she'd say, "We can't pay our bills. We can't make ends meet." But, you know, I caddied. I'd make $24 on a good weekend. I'd give her 20. My brother worked in the orange grove next door. He made about 30 bucks a week. He'd give her 25. Between that and the money she was making, we would just scrape it out, month to month. Things got better. There's so many opportunities in the United States that I need to take a drink. That's opportunity. At any rate, there were opportunities for progression, particularly for my mother. She took advantage of them, and eventually, years later, retired from a school district with a nice pension. Life became good. When we were going through the period of trying to make ends meet, which lasted probably 5 or 6 years, we were constantly thinking about how do we work this out? How do we pay our bills? How do we balance our budget? There were no credit cards in those days. There were later, there weren't then. There was no real relief available. There was California state unemployment, but we were all working, so we didn't qualify for it. So going forward, we did work it out, everything came about. Now, how does that relate to convention estates? I got a call from Chris LeCount, who was at that time the state chair, and he said, you know, are you interested in convention estates? I had expressed interest. He said, what's your interest? I said, I want to serve my country. He said, well, there's a great opportunity. We need somebody to rally people on the Western Slope. I said, I'll do it. So, what was my motivation? My motivation was to go up against this current system that my mother never was able to take advantage of, which is to spend money you don't have. She never could print money. She had to find the money through honest means. What the hell has happened to us? I just saw a statistic this morning. Last year, 58% of the people in this country are dependent upon some form of entitlement. Next year, it's going to be almost 70. So my motivation for supporting this wonderful cause, yeah, I do want term limits. And yeah, I insist we get the states' rights back. But when it comes to the real bottom line for me, is I want a balanced budget. I want to start reducing the national debt so that we're not passing this forward to the 9th generation in front of us. So, thank you. So when you are asked to put effort into this, remember Emily Nicholson. Emily was a hell of a woman. She fought the system enough, legitimately and fairly, to where she rose above it. This country we have, there's never been anything like it. The opportunity here, just think of how lucky I am. Born in England, coming here at 11, could I have done the things? I've got 4 college graduates for my children. They're all very successful. 8 great-grandchildren, 8 grandchildren, I have no great-grandchildren, 8 grandchildren. They're all on great paths, okay? That would not have happened in England. It just wouldn't. Not because England's bad, but because the United States is so freaking great. But I attribute my involvement and any success that I've brought along with me to this organization to my mother, Emily Nicholson. She was a hell of a woman. That's it.